Welcome to today's NFDI talk. This episode is about sociodemographic standard variables for survey research in Germany. And we welcome our speaker, Dr. Silke Schneider, here today. Silke Schneider is a sociologist focusing on social inequalities, survey measurement, and of social structure and cross-cultural research. She's involved in KonsortSWD, NFDI for Society, working on Measure TA3 M1 to harmonize sociodemographic variables across major German survey studies. Between 2018 and 2024, she also led GESE's contributions to the International Consortium of OECD's program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, Cycle 2, focusing on background questionnaires and education measurements, and is in similar consulting role for the European Social Survey since 2009. Dr. Schneider holds a master's degree in sociology from the University of Cologne and a DPhil from the University of Oxford. Welcome, Silke. I will now hand over to you.
Thank you very much for your very kind and comprehensive introduction. I'm very happy to present this work from the first funding phase of KonsortSWD here. And since the second one has started, it's also a very good starting point for the second funding phase and also my first talk for this year. So welcome to you all. I've seen that we have a broad audience across disciplines, and that is what I was hoping for, and I'm very much looking forward to questions and getting in touch also with people from NFDI for Health I've already seen, and others that I don't have regular contact with, but that's why we're here for. That's great. So I will just give an overview of the content of what I'll be talking about in this talk. I have brought a relatively comprehensive introduction, taking into account the broad audience here, where I will talk about the kind of data we're looking at, the characteristics, what sociodemographics are there for, problems with them, and proposed solution. In the next larger section, I'll look at generally the development process for sociodemographic standard variables, development steps, components, sources of standards, different kinds of versions, and validation specifically. And then there's also a longer section with two examples, namely citizenship and marital status. And I'll conclude with an outlook, and then we'll have time for questions. So what kind of data and characteristics will I be talking about? Here, this work is on research data on human individuals, mostly in quantitative, social, and behavioral sciences, resulting from mostly survey questionnaires, social surveys, health surveys, education studies, and various others. But it's also in principle applicable to registered data, social media profiles, and other types of data on human individuals. Sociodemographics are characteristics that tell us which social groups or categories somebody belongs to and where they generally stand in society. And in sociology, we call this the social structure. Here's a brief overview of sociodemographics that we find in many questionnaires or survey data sets. Amongst basic attributes are, of course, date of birth or age calculated thereof, sex, more recently coming up more studies involving gender identity as well, place of residence, and education. Regarding labor market relevant characteristics, main activity status, employment status, occupation, status in employment, and net household income are quite commonly collected in questionnaires. With reference to migration and culture, we have measures of citizenship, migration experience, religious affiliation, sometimes as well, ethnic identity and background, quite rare in Germany, but more important in other countries, and also language. And finally, with respect to the area of family and household characteristics, marital status, partnership, household size, household composition, and the number of children. There's, of course, many more, but this is kind of the core scope that we have looked into in the project, and it's already enough. Why are sociodemographics important? The simple reason is that sociodemographic characteristics affect many outcomes and may also interact with other predictors when we look at statistical modeling. Substantively, sociodemographics are core independent or dependent variables in social stratification research. So whenever we're studying social, educational, gender, ethnic, health, or other types of inequalities. As such, they are also often politically relevant, and some are also means of intervention. For example, what happens to certain outcomes if we improve people's incomes. Methodologically, however, if sociodemographics are not interesting in themselves, they are also commonly relevant control variables to avoid biased effects of other variables. So even if you're not interested in these, from my perspective, super interesting sociological questions, you may still want to include these measures in your models to avoid misinterpretations. So in terms of control variables, they're also often called background variables. The problem. First of all, I'm looking at surveys in Germany. Internationally, this is getting even more complicated, but I come from the internationally comparative research area and therefore bring some kind of sensitivity to issues of comparability with me, which I think this work benefits from. The problem here is that surveys in Germany and also likely in other countries broadly cover the same kinds of sociodemographic characteristics, but they use different questionnaire items for the same characteristic in their questionnaires. And in Germany, we can say, despite the fact that we do have the so-called demographic standards or demographische Standards, which are recommended standard items for sociodemographic characteristics in German surveys, which have existed since the early 1990s. So they are quite old, and many people know them. Still, not many surveys use them, or very often not the very large surveys that we use for scientific research. And due to this usage of different questionnaire items for the same concept, so even for age or for sex, the question wording is not totally standardized. The source variables are often not directly comparable. So that's a problem. Comparability can, however, often be achieved through recoding information. This has happened so far only selectively ex post, so after data collection for individual projects. For example, the SILS4EU study was harmonized with the NAPS starting cohort 4. That was also funded work by KonsortSWD. And I have also put the links here in the slides. So when you later look at the slides, you can access this further information. There's also a project that GESIS has led in the past, for example, on Bound and HASPAT on family surveys or international surveys on religious affiliations and nationality, who have done such ex post harmonization. However, there is for German survey data, or there was no standardized target variables available for this purpose that every project could rely on. So every project redeveloped their own solutions. So the development of sociodemographic standard variables was seen as one solution to these issues that could help researchers and also research data centers in the long term. These are specifications of metadata for uniform target variables to be derived from inconsistent source variables in different survey datasets as a result of the different survey questionnaires. And these are meant to complement sociodemographic standard items. What are the aims of sociodemographic standardization? We're also talking about the FAIR criteria a lot in survey in research data management, and for sociodemographic standardization, interoperability and reusability are two aims. But to achieve that, we first of all have to improve comparability of sociodemographic variables across data sets, and that's the main motivating factor for me to facilitate the interpretation of research findings resulting from different data sources. And also, we want to know whether research results, if they differ across studies with very similar research questions, do they differ because of non-comparable measurement or because of real differences? And that's very important. So as regards to the interoperability criterion and FAIR, very often interoperability is looked at from a technical viewpoint only. But if we have technically compatible research data, but they are not also comparable and interoperable substance-wise, then they are still not fully interoperable from my point of view. And predefined metadata for each attribute in the data can help us achieving substantive interoperability. Once we have that, this increases the reusability of the data and thus also the data usage, for example, by facilitating secondary analysis, meta-analysis, the accumulation of data from different sources to study small groups or rare events, or data linkage, which are otherwise more complex and more time-consuming. Okay, so that was the introduction. Now moving on to the development process. We took several steps. First of all, we had to gain understanding of the measurement of sociodemographics in German surveys, because this is a complex landscape, and coming from the international side, I had to really learn a lot myself first here. And we drafted a report with an overview of the status quo at the time in 2020, 2021, asking how different large-scale surveys in Germany collect data on various sociodemographic characteristics, and discuss the results and potential harmonization ideas with survey representatives in online roundtable meetings to gain community feedback. And a report on this is available on Zenodo. The second step, after we knew which characteristics are measured and how they are measured across large-scale surveys in Germany, we started developing solutions for sociodemographic standard variables. We developed candidates for standard variables for selected characteristics and prioritized a bit what was easy to do, what we could build upon, and what we knew well. And whenever various options existed, we conducted validation analysis to find out which candidate performed best and can actually be recommended for empirical research. And as a last step in this part, we implemented standard variables in datasets. As use cases, we used the German General Social Survey, the ALBUS, the data collected in 2021, and the dataset containing these variables is now available on the GESIS website, and the link is also there. And also in the National Education Panel Study, in starting cohort 6, adults, this dataset has not yet been published, though. The third step then was to draft a paper with background information on sociodemographic standard variables and also standard items, validation results, specifications in an appendix, etc. So basically that paper is the background of this talk mainly, so you can later on also look at it. And also we drafted then documentation by groups of characteristics for publication in CIS. And CIS is the open access repository for social science measurement instruments at GESIS, which was so far lacking information on sociodemographics. And so we could fill this in, this gap for researchers looking for measurement instruments. They can now also find the standard instruments there for sociodemographics, as well as the standard variables in case that the instruments cannot be implemented in their survey for whatever reason. Now, what are the components of standard variables? The metadata. At the variable level, we fixed variable names in using English concept terms and prefixed them all with X underscore, so they are easy to find in datasets later, because we expect that people will merge these harmonized variables with data that they already have. And of course, the variable label is also fixed, but we offer an English and a German version because some research data centers prefer to document their data not just in English, but also in German, or not just in German, but also in English. So just as the example here, the variable name for the main status variable is X underscore main status. For marital status, it's X underscore marital, because we thought status can be neglected there. The variable label in English, main status and marital status, and in German, Hauptstatus and Familienstand. So very straightforward to fix that first. At the value level, and that's where it gets complicated, because that's where the incomparability mostly is across source variables. The values or codes are specified. With each code or value, a label is specified and fixed both again in English and German. And for all standard variables, we also specified a missing value scheme, because also those are very different across surveys, and we don't need that many very often, but a few ones that occur repeatedly and are interesting for data users as well. Generally, we used low-tech substantive solutions, so the standard variable specifications are available in CSV files that can be machine read. But I had some negative experience with software development related projects and maintenance. It's really hard, so this is something that can hopefully stay with us without much substance and knowledge and technical issues. There are explanatory notes in these CSV files. They are quite minimalistic, but give some basic information and references, which are also included in the sys entries, of course, which are much more comprehensive. And yeah, as I said, further details are available in the related publications. So where do we take the code schemes from? Of course, there's no point in reinventing the wheel when there are established classifications available for certain concepts. And for example, whenever we developed standard variables involving countries or citizenships, we could use or refer to the international ISO code or the German Staats- und Gebietssystematik from official statistics in Germany. For education, there is an international standard classification of education and the Casmin scheme, both developed for comparative research, but the Casmin scheme was developed by Germans with a very good knowledge of the German system, and it also works very well for Germany. For occupation, there's again an international classification and a German classification. So that's quite commonly the situation, that there is national and international classifications, and we try to implement them both because of the different usage scenarios. Regarding simple coding schemes where no such established classifications are available, we sometimes use the demographic standards for inspiration, the EU key social variables, also established surveys that we had reviewed in the first phase of the project and found really good solutions sometimes. Other harmonization projects, but we also did our own development work. We also worked with maximum and minimum versions, and I'll explain a bit about those, because there's always this tension that surveys cannot always ask for the same level of detail, be it for data protection reasons or because a specific survey project doesn't need very detailed information, but others will. And in a harmonized data set, we do not want to throw out information for everybody when it's available for some projects. So the maximum versions of the standard variables preserve information and thus validity of the variables as much as possible. And thereby they also allow the simplification for data user-specific research questions. However, they cannot be derived for all surveys or data sets, given the questionnaire items sometimes are not detailed enough. And this is totally fair. Therefore, we also develop minimum versions, which can be generated by most surveys. However, we here can expect a loss of validity or predictive power because of the simplifications compared to the maximum versions. They could also sometimes be too unspecific for certain research questions. So, and we implement these maximum and minimum versions using hierarchical coding systems. So these are not separate variables, but in one variable, it's possible to code different amounts of detail. And I'll show you in the examples later, I show you how that works. Finally, now in this section, our validation approach, all the standard variables which we developed, for which competing versions were developed, underwent an empirical validation to determine the version that statistically best predicts other variables. One of these validation studies has by now been published, which is on education. As data source, we used the Albus 2018, which was the latest Albus data available at the time. And we used a big data kind of approach for the selection of validation variables. So we didn't use only one or a couple of validation variables, as has commonly been done in the past for similar analysis, but we used a lot of variables and therefore also a lot of models to generate averages later later on and be less dependent on the choice of validation variable. So all variables with ordinal or continuous scales with at least 5 scale points were used, which had at least some relevance regarding sociodemographic characteristics, or the one that was being validated. And that resulted in 157 validation or dependent variables for education, 112 for status and employment, 90 for household income, 45 for marital status, and 24 for employment. There you already see which variables explain a lot and are important and which do less so. So education is really, that's why it's one of the basic variables and not an employment-related one. Our analysis strategy was that the candidate versions of each standard variable was used as a predictor in otherwise identical regression models. The predictive power of each version was compared to the predictive power of the most detailed or maximum version, which sometimes was equivalent to the source variable. And we averaged the predictive power across validation variables, so across the dependent variables, the many ones that I mentioned earlier, to check which version worked best. And partial adjusted R-square was used as the measure of predictive power. Now we'll turn to the examples, and I will, for one of these, also show some validation results. First, citizenship. Conceptually, that is the legal relationship between a person and a state, which does not necessarily coincide with nationality, but it overlaps. Conceptually, all surveys in Germany ask about citizenship, not nationality. That all the surveys that we checked, even though the term used in German in questionnaires is usually Staatsangehörigkeit and not Staatsbürgerschaft, but that is based on the fact that our basic law or constitution pretty much equates both of these, which is not the case in other countries necessarily. So that's very often these things are quite nationally specific and based on legal situations. The questionnaire items that we found for collecting information on citizenship differ. So there's basically 2 ways of asking for it. One uses several questions, very often 2 questions, where there's firstly a question whether the respondent has German citizenship, so a yes/no question. And if the respondent says no, there is a follow-up question which citizenship the respondent has. And if yes, sometimes there is a question on whether there is a second citizenship and which one that may be. The level of detail asked for really differs by survey. Or the alternative design is to use one multiple response question on detailed citizenship with German as one response option among others. So some equivalent information can be derived from both these question formats, but the way it's asked and also the maximum information you can get out of it is different. So I will show you the standard variables we developed for citizenship. The first one is citizenship of the survey country, and you can already see that we didn't say German citizenship because people said, well, maybe you want to later on use this internationally as well. So let's not use too many references to Germany if they are not needed, like in this case. You see the variable name here, and it's an extended yes/no scheme. So this is one of these hierarchical coding schemes that I mentioned earlier, but it has only 2 digits, so it's quite simple. And for most analysis situations, the first digit, which just notes whether somebody has German citizenship, yes or no, is sufficient. But since in some data sets we have more information, we wanted to safeguard that information as well, and that's why we have the maximum version and use the second digit for that as well, namely whether somebody has exclusively German citizenship as the 1 on the second digit or exclusively 1 foreign citizenship. That's again the 1 on the second digit just for those without German citizenship. And then whether somebody has also another citizenship, so people with dual or more citizenships. Also, the community was in one of the round tables. We were informed, because that's not our practical experience, because we don't work with the research data ourselves, that stateless people, of course, need to be codable as well. It mostly applies to Palestinians. So therefore, we have a specific code for stateless persons without German citizenship, of course. Now, for many surveys, of course, also collect information on what citizenship people have, so from which country. And here we have 2 standard variables. One uses the German codes from the Staats- und Gebietssystematik, from official statistics, and the other one, the international ISO codes. And these can mostly be coded into each other one-on-one, but not entirely so. And this is where things become complex. The devil is in the detail when looking at things closely. And here, one specific situation relates to Serbia and Kosovo. Kosovo is recognized by Germany, but not by the UN. And therefore, the ISO coding scheme does not have a code for Serbia without Kosovo and for Kosovo. The code that is here in the ISO for Kosovo is an unofficial ISO code for purely statistical purposes, as they call it. So there's sometimes these workarounds at the international level as well, and this one is the best equivalent we can find for the German Kosovo code. But whenever you have data across countries and you want to transform these coding schemes into each other, it's not entirely equivalent. Right. So since this is now these are established code schemes, of course, we didn't do any validation work. It's also a detailed coding scheme. There is nothing really to validate because it's very factual and in that way simple. Now let's come to marital status as the second example. Marital status refers to the situation of an individual regarding his or her legally sanctioned relationship with another natural person, and it describes whether a person is or was married or in a registered civil partnership, if they are married, if they are living together, or whether they have separated, and if they were married or in a registered civil partnership, whether the marriage or registered civil partnership was terminated, either by divorce or dissolution of the civil partnership or the death of the partner. So these are the basic categories that we can find also across countries, basically in terms of marital status definitions. And here we proposed several versions because the way it can be disaggregated it differs. The maximum version has all these different situations and additionally differentiate between people who are married in the traditional marriage and those who are in a civil partnership. So even though legally it is now in Germany possible to get a traditional marriage for same-sex couples, those who established a civil partnership in the past when that was not possible did not have to change that status, or they are not automatically transformed to marriages. So civil partnerships continue to exist. So that information may still be relevant. However, we expect that it's not highly important anymore. It's also not an indicator for same-sex couples because same-sex couples can get married by now. So we developed an intermediate version which ignores the difference between marriages and civil partnerships. Then we developed a minimum version that merges all people who are married or in a civil partnership, regardless of whether they live together or whether they are separated. And the other categories remained. And then there's also an extreme minimum version that we proposed, which is just a binary variable, whether people are married or in civil partnership, or whether that's not the case. So in that case, whether there was a divorce or people are single or a partner died, they're alone, there's no distinction. So the validation analysis, the maximum version was used as a benchmark. So we set the R-squares across the different outcome or validation variables to 100%. And when we looked at the intermediate version, here we lost only 1 percentage point explanatory power across all the outcome variables. So we can say the intermediate version is really, really good, and you do not lose much by omitting the distinction between traditional marriages and civil partnership. However, moving on to the minimum version, we see that another 11 percentage points of explanatory power across all the outcome variables get lost. So whether people who are married or in a civil partnership live together or are separated does make a difference for outcomes. And that's quite plausible, I think, also theoretically. Furthermore, when reducing it to 2 categories, another 22 percentage points information or predictive power is getting lost. So that version we would not recommend using, except in situations when really this is the only distinction people want to look at for theoretical purposes. That also as a control variable, for example, I would not do that. So we have two versions which we think are great, and a minimum version which is kind of acceptable still. And here is the hierarchical coding scheme that we developed for marital status. It has 3 digits, which sounds like a lot, but since all the information is distributed across digits, of course, there's not 999 categories. We ordered them by the life course. So first you're single, then you may be married or in a partnership, then maybe divorced, and eventually be widowed. So the first digit carries that information. The intermediate version is then noted on the second digit, and it only distinguishes amongst the married group those who are living together or are separated. So that's just an addition of 2 categories. And then the maximum version in each of the relevant categories distinguishes on the third digit, again with just a 1 and a 2, whether it's a marriage or civil partnership. And whenever we don't know this kind of information, a 0 is used as a kind of placeholder, which is noted by the not further specified shorthand here. Now we come to our outlook. Firstly, the project output. What are the standard variables that were developed and documented in SIS? The blue ones have been documented in the SIS portal, so you can look them up there. Occupation and education are still in the making, with occupation being quite far advanced. Education, unfortunately, not, because we were waiting for the publication to be finalized, because, of course, it would be quite unfortunate if reviewers give feedback and then destroy the standard that you've already published. And the gray ones could potentially be worked on in the future, but there are no standards available yet for various reasons. Sometimes validation didn't work well. Sometimes the community is not yet very clear yet on what the standard could look like. This is the current list of sociodemographic standard variables. I'll certainly not read this to you, but in the appendix to the report, you can find the full details and also, of course, a list. Documentation and usage, so the general framework, the validation results, and the specifications for the existing variables are available on Zenodo, and I published the second version, or 1.1 it is, just today. So this is now totally up to date again. The specifications together with standard items from the demographic standards mostly are also documented in the CIS portal by characteristics. So here you can really look into detail and get a lot of information on, say, citizenship or migration experience or age or sex, etc. The standard variables can be implemented by research data centers directly or also by data users. As I mentioned, it was already done in Albus and NEPS. The question is now, who is next? I have some guesses, but I'm super happy for research data centers and data producers to step forward if they're interested to implement them. And now comes the outlook, because the second funding phase of KonsortSWD has just started. There are some plans for the measure STANDEM, as it is now called, in the second funding phase, which will start mostly in March with only some pre-work now. We'll support the research data centers and data users in implementation, because not all possible scenarios can be included in the documentation. All surveys are different, and also we are making mistakes or omissions in these complex situations. So it's unfortunately not the case that you can drop the documentation on Zenodo and then ask people to just go and do it, because that may result still in incomparable data in some cases. We may update some existing specifications if needed. We'll develop a business model for long-term maintenance. We'll hold annual roundtable meetings to discuss scientific developments and user needs, and we'll invite broadly for these in the NFDI and beyond. And if resources allow, we'll also extend the set of sociodemographic standard variables, maybe also by building on cooperation with stakeholders and people who are specifically interested in certain characteristics. So, for example, for income, status in employment, and household composition, I have some ideas, and we have done quite a lot of work already, but it's not has not been published yet, or is not fully developed yet. Technical improvements are certainly also possible. We could, for example, think about DDI, which is the Data Documentation Initiative, metadata standards. I'm not sure, though, whether and how important that is and how helpful in practice. For questionnaires, of course, it would make a lot of sense to program Lime survey templates for standard items, which has not happened yet. Also, machine readability could be improved potentially. Quality assurance and control is also important in the long run. So research accompanying this kind of work is always important. I also want to say something about limitations of the approach, which I think are very important. Given that the questionnaire items provide the stimulus for respondents, input standardization is still the best means to obtain comparable data. So depending on the attribute and the way question items are designed, standard variables may only achieve a mediocre degree of comparability. For example, asking about employment, you can do in many different ways, and the employment rate and the unemployment rate could end up being quite different. That's why at the international level, there are also quite clear standards by the ILO on how to measure employment and unemployment, which is also used in international employment statistics. So really, output harmonization ex post is always only the second best solution. And it's a bit heartbreaking to put so much effort into the second best solution, but the first solution is unfortunately not realistic to achieve either across surveys. But still, I think we should hold the aim for standard items high as much as we can. So to summarize how to achieve standard sociodemographics, firstly, standardized input, meaning data collection instruments, questionnaires, for which we do have the demographic standards in Germany. And secondly, if that doesn't work, you can resort to output harmonization using harmonized standardized variables and data coding, such as the KonsortSWD standard variables. So use the tandem and go for tandem. That's the promise here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Silke, for your great presentation. And with that, we say goodbye on YouTube first. In our next episode of the NFDI talk on the 2nd of February, we will have a talk about introduction to NFDI RC, a concept for standardization of RDM by NFDI for Inch. And with that, I will stop the stream on YouTube. Okay. And now